I'm Nick Altmeyer with linkinglewiscounty.com. Here today with Lewis County Manager Tim Hunt. Welcome, Tim. Thanks for stopping by today.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
All right. So today we're here to talk about the 2025 tentative budget that's been put forward by Lewis County. So this is your first budget as county manager.
Yes.
So if you want to start out, just walk us through the process a little bit about like what goes in before we get into all the details of the budget. What goes into putting the budget together?
So this was my first budget, and I kind of started almost midstream in this budget. But so typically we send out an email to all the department heads.
Right.
And we kind of outline what we believe are going to be the challenges for the year. So this year we saw sales tax being flat for next year. So we can't, looking at our revenue, we understand it's going to be very flat.
Right.
So we sent an email out to the department heads saying, when you start preparing your departmental budget, we need you to be as tight as possible to last year's. We really don't want to see any large increases because we knew we were going to have labor increases due to the contract last year.
Right.
So, just trying to get the department heads, you want to set that stage, right? Don't come with any big crazy proposals or any large spending things, because our goal is to really try as hard as possible to contain spending this year. And that's what we did. We met with the departments. They all had very good, very reasonable, rational departments. When they came asking for new positions, which is typical, they were very thought out, very rational, and in many cases they gave up other positions to get this new one.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to get the department heads to do, is look at all of their positions and say, it'd be more efficient if we had this and maybe eliminated this and this.
Right.
And that's, so we were able to do this budget with one additional employee actually added to the roles.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll get to that in a little bit when we get down into some of the more detailed parts of the budget.
Sure.
But basically with process, it's the kind of thing that you guys really start full steam, or not full steam, but you kind of get the ball rolling in the springtime, get emails up to the department heads and things like that, kind of get a feeling for what's needed in the county, what kind of equipment needs there are, what things need to replace, what kind of employees and stuff like that. And then it really takes off in the summertime when you start sitting down with the department heads, and then I think it's usually like by late September, early October, you're getting a budget.
This year in August, we started meeting with the department heads.
Okay.
And then by September, we started, kind of, first, you get a first glance at like, this is, we've got a deficit here. We can't have that.
Right.
So what can we do to trim that out and cut here and cut there? And kind of look at the requests that everybody brings forth.
Right.
And say, no, not this year, not that, we can't do that.
Right.
So,
then it gets to the committee process, usually in October, where you present it to the legislators. They kind of get to take a look at it, make their recommendations, and then what we're coming up on is, and the point of our interview today is, you'll be having a public hearing where the public will be able to come out and have their say on the budget.
Absolutely.
And that's going to be on November 26th at 5 p.m.
Yes.
It's a Tuesday, like a lot of your board meetings are held. And that'll be right in the board chambers.
Right in the legislative chambers. And always we want the public to comment on the budget. We understand, and I think take the responsibility of creating a budget very seriously.
Right.
Taxing people is a very serious thing, and we don't want to overtax people. We have an obligation to provide certain services, but we don't want to overspend and then force people out of their homes. So we try very hard to balance that. And certainly, everybody's welcome to come out if there's concerns or issues where we didn't get it right, but we try very hard to get it right.
Right. Okay, so when we really start drilling down into like the specific numbers and things like that this year, so and we can throw the slide up on the screen too, that kind of has the budget breakdown showing expenditures, revenues, where the revenues come from, things like that. So we'll go ahead and throw that up. But basically what we're talking about this year is actual proposed spending this year is going to be at $64.9 million. Which last year it was around 62 million, 62.1. So you're looking at about a 4% increase in overall spending this year.
Correct.
So we talked a little bit, and we'll get into the tax rates and things like that, but what were some of the things that drove the cost of the budget, the spending up this year?
The spending up this year. So the biggest driver was labor.
Right.
we had two major components. One was the IGT, which is the amount we budget for payments to the hospital. In New York State, the IGT is the intergovernmental transfer.
Right.
And when we make that payment, it gets doubled and sent to the hospital. So it's a great deal for the taxpayers in Lewis County for us to do that. But we've been watching that trend, and it's coming out to about $3.5 million a year, and we weren't budgeting that. So we had to add $600,000 for that, for the IGT. Then we saw last year, and to be fair to the employees, there were about 3 years where inflation was going up pretty dramatically, and they had a locked-in contract, so they're falling behind. So last year we settled the general contract. The employees got 3.5%. Some of them got steps as well because of longevity, and the overall effect of that was about an 8% increase on labor costs.
And that's when you take into account benefits and the amount that health insurance costs have risen and things like that.
Double digit on health insurance. We had double digit on retirement costs. So New York State retirement system sends Lewis County a bill and says, here's what you owe. And we saw a 20% increase in that. So in that, health insurance, and then our retiree insurance cost, that's a legacy cost that's there. All obligations that we have and we should be making, but those things add up, and you got to be very careful with that labor component. So we knew that labor was going to be there. We knew we had to do something with the IGT, and those were the two big drivers of that spending.
And we were doing a little math off camera before the interview started, as we we're chatting about some of this stuff, and labor is about $28 to $30 million when you count the salaries, the fringe benefits, things like that, which just under half of the county budget. So when you're talking an 8% overall increase in labor expenses and bringing the budget up by 4%, I mean, a lot of the increase in the budget is, like you said, right there in the labor expenses, which are contractual. Insurance, you don't really have a lot to say. Well, have a little bit to say about that.
We do.
You guys are looking into
we're looking
how
at
to
everything.
change the policy or the plans and stuff.
And in all honesty, and this is the hard part, right? So we want to be fair to the taxpayers and try to keep the tax rate and the tax levy as low as possible. But the employees got a 3.5% increase, and then 6 months later they get a double-digit increase in their health insurance, and they actually take home less money than they were. So, you're trying to be fair to your employees and balance that with the tax levy. And that's the really, when we say we try to get it right, that's the trick right there.
And the other driving factor that you mentioned too, the IGT payment, that's something that's pretty unique to Lewis County, especially here in New York State. And the reason for the IGT payment is because it's a municipally owned hospital. So basically the municipality pays a chunk of their operating costs, and then that gets equaled by the state, contributes the the same amount. So
I think there was a recognition that a municipally owned hospital is going to have different costs associated with it. And so the state said we'll match the funds that the local government puts in to help that. And there's only 2 county-owned hospitals in New York State, here and in Wyoming County. I can tell you that we are so blessed to have Lewis County Hospital here. For $3.5 million a year is what we budget for the IGT payment out of a $64 million budget. That is an investment well worth making to have this here. It employs 600 people in our local economy, as well as the access that we all have. I mean, is amazing. To be able to drive up there, see your doctor, walk down the hall, get your blood work. People don't realize how blessed we are to have that kind of small town personal service. So
and to contribute, I mean, they run on an $80+ million budget a year. So the $3 million, it's not like it's funding the whole hospital. It's just a contribution that the county makes as having ownership in the hospital.
Absolutely.
Okay, so so we talked about the increase in spending. So now it's time to get to the part that that impacts everybody's bottom line and their pocketbook and their dollars. So when we're talking about tax rates and things like that, so we are And this is where things get a little bit confusing depending on reevaluation rates and where you live and whether your local municipalities are keeping up on your appraisals and assessed values and things like that. Everybody, the numbers vary a little bit and are a little bit differently, but overall, the property tax rate is set to go down by 1%. But the amount to be collected through taxes is actually going up by a little over $1 million. So last year you guys collected little over $18 million in the property tax levy. This year that amount's going to jump up to 19.9, it looks like. Or is it 19? I'm going to look down on my notes here. 19.9. So tax rate, the amount you're paying per $100,000 is going from $637 to $631, I believe. From last year.
6 cents is the decrease in the tax rate.
Okay. So that's what you're paying per $100,000, but if your appraisals went up, if your home was worth $100,000 last year and it's worth $120,000 this year, you're going to pay less per $100,000, but you might be paying a little bit more in your tax bill just because of the assessed values and things like that.
Now, before we get there, it's important to note what the levy is. So we talk about the levy and we talk about the tax rate. The levy is the amount of the budget that the taxpayers have to pay. Now we have a $64 million budget. The taxpayers are not going to pay $64 million. What we're putting on the taxpayers is about $19 million.
Well, property taxpayers.
Property taxpayers, correct.
Because sales tax, I mean, that's still a tax to the residents. That's another $19 million. So.
That's another, roughly $19 million. And then there's, another third of that is coming from state programs, right? So a lot of the programs, for example, at social services are mandated, but there's revenue streams for that. Department of Health, the same thing. So we have a lot of internal state revenue that picks up about a third of that $64 million budget. Another third is sales tax, and then whatever's left is the levy. Now, if sales tax is rising very quickly, the levy tends to shrink because we can pay for more of the spending with sales tax, which has been the case for the last 3 or 4 years. That is not the case going forward. We don't anticipate sales tax growing. We anticipate it to be flat.
There are a lot of reasons for that. I mean, we've talked about high inflationary period over the last 3 or 4 years, and 2024 is when you really started to see some of the inflation numbers start to come down, and that has to impact the the bottom line for the county in sales tax dollars, because if gas is $5 a gallon and you're making 4 cents on every dollar, you're making 20 cents on a gallon of gas, where if gas is at $3, 4 cents a gallon, or 4 cents a dollar, you're making 12 cents on the gallon. So.
And it's always interesting that we try to analyze the sales tax because it kind of points us into what might be happening in our community. And building supplies, for example, is down 20%, right? So we knew during COVID, everybody was building and house prices were going up, and we saw a huge increase in sales tax revenue from building supplies because either people were renovating their homes or they were building a home, and so we're seeing that come down a little bit. So that might be down the road. Does that mean that property tax values also stabilize? So these things all kind of tie into each other. But the reason I want to bring that up is last year, if you remember, we lowered the levy because we had quite a bit of sales tax revenue. And so we actually lowered the levy. Well, now whenever you raise the levy more than 2%, you have to go through the property tax cap, which we are doing.
And I think last year, if I recall correctly, it was the first time that sales tax revenues were projected to be higher than the tax level.
They were equal to the tax level. And that's really the first time. And one of the big changes that happened for places like Lewis County is sales tax never used to be collected on internet sales. And when they did that, that was a huge boost to a lot of small communities that, like Lewis County, because, people are ordering on Amazon now are paying a tax on that, and it's being directed here.
And you used to have the small, maybe the mom or pop shop or the local person that is, was in business 30 years ago, and we don't have those shops anymore. So you used to get the sales tax dollars on those products and things like that. And then for a long time in the early days of the internet, that you weren't getting the sales tax on that. So it's kind of equaled back out now, where you're getting the sales tax on almost everything people buy outside of food and things like that.
And we saw this year an increase actually in sales tax revenue from clothing.
Right.
And we think it's because there was a new clothing store opened up in Lewis County.
Right.
So I can't emphasize enough how important tourism is to our economy, because the more sales tax revenue we have, the more we can keep people's property taxes down. Right. And it's just a conversation to have. We are a function of the economy, and when the economy slows.
So just since last year, so in last year's budget, we had total amount of property value in Lewis County was just over $2.8 billion. So that's the assessed rate for that you guys are allowed to collect property taxes on. That overall big number was 2.8 billion last year. And that's went up to 3.1 billion this year. So you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in increased property values. So that kind of gets us into the levies and things like that a little bit. We did mention, or I think you started to mention, that you guys will be exceeding the property tax cap this year. So people are going to think, well, you're dropping the tax level by 1%. It's going from 637 to 631. Right. How are you exceeding the 2% property tax cap?
Because the base has grown.
The base is growing, and basically, getting back to what you were just explaining, the amount to be collected through taxes, that's where that 2% comes into effect. Yes. So last year you collected 18. Let me look at my notes again here. You collected just over 18.2 million in the tax levy, and this year it's up to 19.9.
Yes.
So that significant increase in the tax levy is what triggers New York State to say you're exceeding the property tax cap.
And at the same time reducing the tax rate, because if you take that 19 million that we need to collect and you just divide it by that $3.1 billion of assessed value, that's how you come up with your rate. Right. That's literally, it's fairly simple math. You divide the levy by 1,000 of assessed value, and divide it by the 19 million, and that's the rate that you come up with. Right. So the growth in the base is very good. It's when we have a growing economy in Lewis County, it really helps, and we're starting to see that slow down. But when COVID hit, we saw property tax values go up, we saw sales tax go up. Right. Now those are all starting to flatten off a little bit, and now we have to be more careful with our spending. We have to be really controlled with our spending. Right. So.
And just to close out the thing on exceeding the property tax cap, so back when it was first introduced 10, 15 years ago, there used to be a penalty involved. So if any of the taxing jurisdictions that you lived in exceeded the property tax rate, there was some kind of penalty that the state imposed to taxpayers in that district, whether it was the school district or the town government or the county government, any of those taxing jurisdictions. To your knowledge, is there any kind of, I think it's changed over the last few years, is there any penalty for exceeding, like, our Lewis County resident is going to be penalized for the county exceeding the property tax cap?
No, not to my knowledge. There's one program that we have not ever spent money on that is a fairly new program, and if we exceed the tax cap, then the state won't reimburse for that program. But we've never used it. We don't anticipate using it, and my understanding is that they're not truly enforcing that. But other than that, no, there's not. It's just a majority of legislators have to agree to override, which we have overridden the tax cap. Right. And the law to override the tax cap has been passed. So it's just a matter of presenting the budget. The irony of the 2%, I understand that. I mean, everybody's hurting on their property taxes, right? Nobody wants to see property taxes go up by any means. Right. But the irony is they put in a 2% property tax cap, and we gave our employees a 3.5% cost of living adjustment, which probably wasn't enough. Inflation went, in that 2 or 3 year period, went up more than that. Right. So, it kind of hamstrings us when it comes to things like taking care of your employees and doing the right thing. Right. The other thing that's not really talked a lot about is a lot of the programs that we offer, and you mentioned this earlier, is like infrastructure, right? Our roads.
Right.
That shouldn't be on property taxes. That should be funded some other way, which in New York State, it was the gas tax.
Right.
We would put gas in our car where there's a tax on it. It goes into New York State and is distributed to municipalities.
Right.
The fact that New York State hasn't funded a lot of these programs properly
Right.
shouldn't be the fault of our taxpayers.
Right.
But it tends to happen, right? We have to provide them. We have to maintain the roads and things. We have to do all of these services.
Right.
So, sometimes when people go, well, our property taxes are too much, I don't disagree.
Right.
And the question is, how do we get New York State to realize that some of these shouldn't be placed on the property taxes?
Right. And I think, when you're talking about the roads and things like that and the gas tax, that's the money that comes back to you guys in towns and villages through CHIPS funding?
Yes, through the CHIPS funding.
Okay.
Yep.
And I know it's pretty much the case with the villages and the towns that the majority of the road work and stuff that have scheduled for a particular budget year is based on the CHIPS funding.
Exactly.
It's not taking a lot of money from the general fund.
You'd be surprised.
So on the county level, is that the case?
Right
A lot comes from the general fund?
Absolutely.
In addition to the CHIPS
In
funding?
addition to the CHIPS funding. So the CHIPS funding really only pays for paving and, capital projects. All of the labor costs, all of the equipment costs, all
plowing,
of that. Yeah, all plowing, all of that, that's coming out of the general fund.
Right.
So, the question is that enough? And I think we've seen that too also with the school aid formula debate, right?
Right.
Is there certain things that, everybody in New York State should be contributing to,
right.
but we end up having to pick up a little bit of it on our local property taxes. But, we're very cognizant of the impacts that the property taxes have on folks, and we're doing our best to try to control those costs.
Right. So we did, we've kind of already touched on all of the areas with significant increases or decreases this year. Mm-hmm. So not really any significant decreases, like not cutting any services or anything like that. No. Increases we already talked about is basically the labor costs were a big driving factor of that. Yep. The IGT payment increase, like you guys, I think for a couple of years, like the IGT, so part of the thing to understand with the IGT is it's not a set number, right? It's based on one of these crazy state formulas, and it's never the same. And one year it might be $3 million, and one year it might be $1 million, and then it might be $6 million. Yep. And then they can go back retroactively and refigure things and say, oh, you owe an extra $500,000 for the last 4 years, and now you have to make it all up in one payment. Yep. So sometimes, not saying that the county's been caught off guard, but sometimes it's been unexpected that a high IGT payment comes in that you guys weren't expecting. So this year, you tried to put more of that into the budget. Yes. So you budgeted that at a higher amount to kind of ease the pain if it is higher than you anticipate.
Well, so you're absolutely right. It's all over the place. So if you look at a 10-year, 12-year history of that IGT payment, some years it's non-existent. Some years it's $1 million. Other years it's $8 million. Right. And you don't know. You just don't know.
Right.
But what we do is we kind of try to look at a trend and say, on average, what's it running? Right. And we know it's about $3.5 million on average. Right. So if we budget $3.5 million and this year it's only $1 million, we're going to put the rest of it into a capital reserve fund so that the following year, if it's $5 million and we budgeted $3.5, we have that money.
Gotcha.
So the idea is to try to stabilize the tax rate and try to stabilize our fund balance. Right. We don't want our fund balance going up and down and having these big swings either. So the fund balance is really there for those emergencies. Expenditures. Right. This one we know kind of comes and goes. So we're going to create a capital reserve fund and just try to manage that. Over what's the average.
Right. And we're looking at a pretty healthy fund balance at the moment.
The fund balance is come down. Last year the fund balance was we were roughly 30 million.
Yep.
This year we're looking at 19 million. I think by the end of the year we're predicting it's going to be 18, 19 million. That's still very healthy.
Right.
It hits all the benchmarks. It's still a very good fund balance.
Right.
But you don't want to see the fund balance coming down.
Right.
You'd like to see it just a nice stable number. We don't want to add to it. We don't want to take away from it. We just want to keep it there, for those fluctuations.
Right.
And
in order to, even though the amount to be collected through taxes, went up by a little, $1.5 million or whatever, you guys are applying 1.9 million from the fund balance, which actually saved that amount from being double
from being
what
double,
it, you know what I mean? Like,
and that's exactly why you want to have a healthy fund balance, because when necessary, you want to put it in to keep the tax rate as stable as possible.
Right. Okay. And then the last thing on significant changes or whatever, which really isn't significant this year, but we already talked about it, that as far as like the county workforce, we're looking at a net gain of 1 employee to the workforce, which is going to bring our total county workforce to 300 and had it written down here somewhere. I think it's 355.
Yeah, 50. Yep, I think it's 55 or 58. I can't remember the number exactly. But
yes. Yep. Looks like 355.
355. Yep.
So basically, and I think you mentioned that the added position was a deputy at the sheriff's office.
A deputy sheriff, and the sheriff's department is really facing a situation that all of us are, and that is they have a number of people that are close to retirement age.
Right.
And it's not like you can just go out and grab somebody off the street and put them in there.
Right.
So we've got to start putting some people into the sheriff's department, getting them through training, getting them ready so that when people retire, you can't just not have somebody.
Right, right.
So we felt that was a pretty urgent need to kind of get somebody up there for the sheriff and help that a little bit.
Right.
It would.
And it can be almost a year process. I mean, I know the village has just been going through the same thing, and they've hired 3 or 4 new officers, but it's almost a year process from the time you make the decision to hire them to get them through the training, and then they need, they have to do academy and all that kind of stuff if they haven't actually been a deputy before.
Yep.
And then you're looking at, they need on-field training before they can be out on their own and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So it's really an 8-month to a year process before they're actually like out on the road and being able to
do their job. And, and what the sheriffs do is such an important position. I mean, honestly, everyone came and had a really compelling story. Anybody who did ask, because they knew we were trying to keep it, had a compelling story. And unfortunately, we said no. We can't. This one we felt, it was urgent enough that the sheriff really needed that one additional position to just start feeding into there. But that's the tough part of a budget every year, right? You have to look at those things and decide which ones are urgent and which ones are not. And so most of them were declined.
Right. So people are probably well aware of over the last 3 or 4 years, the county has had a lot of capital projects, a lot of building projects, a lot of things have been brought up to date, as far as buildings, technology-wise, things like that. So the last 3 or 4 years, when we would sit down at Ryan and have these conversations, there was a lot of talk about what was coming up and, what were the big one-time projects and things like that that were, in the budget for that year. So this year, we've really completed, as people have probably noticed, we've had all kinds of ribbon cutting ceremonies and grand openings and things like that at all the various facilities that have been upgraded and rebuilt and stuff. So this year, we're not looking at any really large, significant, one-time expenditures out of the budget. I think you mentioned there's a couple, renovating the HVAC system at the courthouse, which is like a $250,000 project, not like it's super big. Like
it's actually, to do the HVAC at the courthouse is probably closer to $1 million, but we're going to phase it in over like a 5-year period, so it's a very small, manageable amount. But it's something that has to be done because the boiler is of that age where it's we're in there a lot on a weekend trying to get it up and running and keep heat on in the building, so it's kind of a must-have. So we've really tried to cut back the capital projects. There won't be, my message to the department heads and to the employees is this year, let's just focus on good government. Let's just focus on service delivery and how we can do a better job taking care of our residents here in Lewis County. And we're not going to be going out trying, to take on any huge projects this year. We renovated DSS. We did the DMV Board of Elections building. Highways new. Parks and Recreation has been redone and has a new home with soil and water.
Well, that's not really out of the general fund, but they've had a project.
They've had a project.
Everything's up to date.
Kind of up to date and brought up to stuff. So now it's back to let's just do what we're supposed to do, and that is good service delivery and find ways to serve the community better. And then what we don't want to do in the future is let all of our facilities deteriorate to a point where we have another massive project like that. I would rather see us feed in small capital projects all the time to make sure that our facilities stay in good shape. It's a way smoother approach to capital funding.
Right. Now that you have everything upgraded, it's just a matter of maintaining it and budgeting it here and there. But I don't. It might be hard because, like you said, everything kind of came up at the same time. So, you know what I mean? Everything's going to kind of be on the same time schedule with the buildings and stuff, as far as when things were replaced and things like that. So,
but I think we can start to take highway equipment, right? So all the highway equipment was 20 plus years old and was in really rough condition. And so it all got now the point is just do a couple a year and just maintain a good, healthy,
rotation.
And the same with buildings, right? You can say, okay, they're all new now, but we should look at they're all going to have their roofs replaced in 15 or 20 years, or some sort of
building that fund to be prepared.
So let's start right now for the future to make sure that we're ready to maintain these things properly.
Right. Okay. And then as far as other major projects and things like that, and again, not necessarily coming out of the general fund, but one thing that we'll be looking at this year is, and I think you mentioned it's a record number of bridge replacement projects for the county coming up this year. So you're looking at 6 with a possibility of a 7th through the Bridge New York program.
Yes.
So
there's a little bit of flux that in FEMA because of all the storm damage. We could be doing more than 6, but we have 6 that are already planned and funded and ready to go. So we did 6 this year. We're going to do 6 again next year. And at that pace, we should be able to get our bridges in really, in pretty good order. Our overall bridge condition is not very good. And so we want to be aggressive at trying to get our bridges in a good, healthy place.
Right. Very good. So, I mean, that pretty much wraps up the major spending points, what we're looking at as far as what's increased, what's decreased, which, the overall levy amounts and things like that. So just to recap that, this year's spending plan is coming in at $64.9 million, which is a 4% increase over last year's spending plan. And then the overall tax rate for the county will actually be going down 1%, but the amount collected through taxes will actually be going up, exceeding the property tax cap. And that's basically, like you explained, just balancing out what's left over after you take in the other revenues, what's left for the county residents
to put on the county residents.
So once again, the public hearing, anybody that has a comment or wants to be heard on the budget is going to be on November 26th, and that's at 5 p.m. right at the courthouse in Lowville. If you don't have a comment but are interested in seeing, I'm assuming that's going to be streamed like all the other county meetings are on the county's YouTube channel. And
the budget is available online if anybody wants to get a copy of it and read it. They can get it online, or they can go to the county courthouse and get it from the clerk.
So it's on your website. I know that once you guys published it, I think we published it a couple weeks ago, a link to just the hard copy of the budget document. So if you want to go through, like I did over the last couple of days, all 132 plus pages, line item by line item. It's all right there, and you're able to see that on the county website, or again, we've included the link on our website too. So anything else about the budget or anything that you wanted to add, Tim?
No, I think that's it. I mean, I feel pretty comfortable going through my first one.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're always very nervous, and it is a big balancing act. But you know, you listen to the legislators and you listen to the public, and you try to do the best you can. And I think we've done a pretty good job of saying we understand the taxpayers can't afford more. So let's try to deliver the services as cost effectively as we can.
Right. Now I'm trying to remember from years past, and everything's just kind of jumbled together. The night of the public hearing, will the legislators be voting to adopt the budget that night, or does that happen at the December regular meeting?
No, I believe they'll be adopting it at the end of that.
Okay, so they'll be able to vote on whether to adopt it or not that night.
Mm-hmm.
So November 27th kind of starts the process for, in your eyes at least, for next year's budget, and talking about the whole process and how that plays out, and really get started pretty much the day after you pass a budget. You're already into the mode of what do we have to do for next year. So
right. And one of the things next year, we want to streamline the process a little bit. I'd love to make the budget document a little bit more readable for the public. It's a little bit of fund balance accounting and stuff that sometimes confuses people.
Right.
So we'd like to make it a little bit more plain language. But you know, it's definitely the public's budget, and we're just trying to put it together for them.
Right. Well, we appreciate you stopping by and taking the time to explain this to everybody, Tim, and wish you best of luck with the upcoming budget vote.
Great. Thank you, Nick. I appreciate it.